Welcome to another episode of the Contagious Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle King, and the goal of this podcast is to help you create an ecosystem of academic excellence. Now, what does an ecosystem of academic excellence look like? That looks like an opportunity where students, parents, teachers, educational leaders, board members, and community partners work inclusively together to be able to foster an environment within our classrooms, within our school hallways, within our offices, within our community that gives our students the opportunity and the privilege to thrive academically, socially, intellectually, financially, as well as emotionally. I'm your host, and our culture tip for today is to tell the truth. It's so easy, but I think it's so powerful, and so powerful to the point where we forget it a lot. Oftentimes, educators ask me, or really share with me, that they don't feel supported within the classroom. They don't feel that their administration supports them. They don't feel that their parents really understand them. They don't feel that their students want to be there. But they don't use their voice and advocate for themselves. If you're that educator that doesn't feel supported, what would support look like if you had it? What goals, what gaps do you actually have within your classroom? What resources do you actually need? And have you written them down? Have you attached a deliverable to those resources? And what I mean is, if you were to get Lexia or iReady or SchoolNet, how would that improve your overall academic outcomes of your students within the classroom? If you were to receive that specific support that you're advocating for from that director or from that assistant director or principal, how would your students achieve academic success? If you were allowed to invite parents into the classroom to volunteer a little bit more and you were supported in that way, how would that support academic outcomes? I think a lot of times, even as a leader now, we get bombarded with this idea that support doesn't exist, but when we ask, we don't really know how we're supposed to support teachers. We create programs, we identify funding opportunities, we bring necessary resources that we feel that teachers need. But oftentimes, teachers, administrators, parents, students, we're just not honest. So I want you to be able to focus on being honest this week. Whether it's being honest with a colleague that they're dropping the ball as an educator. Whether that's being honest and showing up to a PLC and saying that, hey, I don't know how to lesson plan this week, or I don't know how to teach this specific piece of this curriculum. Or being honest with the curriculum coordinator and communicating to them that the pacing guide that you've given us doesn't make sense to this demographic of students that we have. Whether it's your instructional sequence doesn't necessarily work in the way that they want you to be able to do it on a district level. Self-advocacy is important. And a culture tip for us today is to be honest, because I think that sets the foundation to everything within a school building. When you think about how you need support, when you think about what could really transform you as a teacher, it reminds me of a student when I first started teaching. And I was at a failing school, and I talk about these experiences often at the school because it transformed my life in so many ways, internally as an educator, but then externally as well. When I was in the class, I came ready to roll. I came as a professional speaker with years of experience. I spoke on stages of 5,000 to 10,000 people, podcasted all over the world, transformed lives in the various businesses that I've built, that I've sold, or even that I've been able to be a part of. I've been in rooms with some of the most wealthy people in business industries, and all of that meant absolutely nothing in the classroom. And one of the things that I had to be honest with, and it was some friction between myself and the assistant principal that I was working with, because I thought that it was the students' problem. I said, look, these students aren't picking up on what I'm essentially putting down. The students aren't wanting to participate in the lessons. The students aren't wanting to be there. It clearly isn't me, because I have all this experience. I know how to professionally speak and all of these different things. And he looked back and told me, he said, Kyle, it's not about you. And if your students aren't engaging, you're the problem. If your students aren't staying awake, you're the problem. If your students aren't focusing on getting the work done, you're the problem. And you have to build an environment within your classroom that is bigger than you. And I think this is one of the biggest pieces as an educator. And we forget this. what I wanted to do is I wanted to come in there and transform students' lives. And it was all about me, and it was all about my 75 students. And I lost the purpose of why I came in there because pride took over that in that moment. The pride said that I want to be able to create the best possible experiences for my 75 students in 8th grade ELA that came through my class so that they can talk about it, so that I could leverage my relationships to build relationships with them, and all of these different opportunities I wanted to create so that I could be seen as the best teacher in 8th grade and in my school. What that did is that created a divide within other teachers. That created a disconnect and a misalignment because I was so focused on my students and I wasn't focusing on moving grade levels and moving a school forward. And that same mentor sat me down and he said, Kyle, even if all of your students were 100% proficient, it would not move the school forward because we need more than 75 students to be able to drive this school from an F to a D. It was a wake-up call. And that honesty that he continued to give me, that honest feedback, that honest criticism, that honest realization woke me up. And it had me change my whole instructional sequence in a way that once I just had a few tweaks, it transformed my engagement in my classroom. It transformed the relationships that I had with my students. It transformed the pacing and the level of focus that they had. And ultimately, it transformed the academic outcomes that I started to see in my students' data. So today I'm going to give you 5 steps. 5 steps to transform your lessons, 5 steps to transform your classroom experience, and 5 steps that I use personally in the classroom as a teacher that really helped me drive engagement, but also educate students in a way that empowered them to be able to drive their scores at the end of the year. As an author, one thing that I always do, and one thing, I don't care what movie you watch, whether you watch movies, write movies, read books, write books, whatever it is, each chapter or each movie starts with some type of hook. Some type of hook. So the first step is, what is your hook? At the beginning of the lesson, or at the beginning of your class, or at the beginning of when you are opening your mouth, what is your hook? What is that thing that you're going to do to drive engagement right back to you? What is the statement that you're going to make? What is the information that's going to be on the whiteboard or the screen? What are you going to say at the beginning of your lesson to drive engagement immediately? Whether that's a story, whether that is a sound that you make, whether that is a hand gesture, whatever it is, how are you going to drive engagement in the first 30 seconds to 60 seconds of once all butts are in seats? Once you've established your hook, what is the thesis? One thing that I always used to do is communicate like, look, once I have all of your attention, what we're going to be doing today is this. And then I would go straight into step 3, which are your takeaways. The goal of today is we're going to focus on these 3 steps, these 3 skills, these 3 activities, these 3 things. Because once I get you locked in with me, now it gives you the opportunity to write these things down with me. Usually I would have something on a whiteboard. We have smart boards at this school. So whether you're using a smart board or a television screen or some form of digital screen, I would have these things up on the screen behind me with a timer counting down, so that the students understood when this timer goes off, we're moving to the next thing. We're moving to the next slide. But this 4th step, which is chapter content or content, is the most powerful. And this is really the sequence and how I broke it down. So the first step is, how are we hooking our students in? What is the hook? How are we driving engagement within the first 30 to 60 seconds? The second step is your thesis. Like, what are we talking about today and why does it matter? The third step is the takeaways of the lesson. Have students write the takeaways down and ensure they are on a screen behind you so that students can see them, they can hear them, and then they're required to actually write these things down. So it's kind of like a checklist on the things once you get to your exit ticket that you can be able to address at the end of the lesson. Now, when we get to the content of the lesson, I broke it down like this. The first step is always a warm-up. Now, depending on the time in your class, will depend on how you break down the specific sequence. So if you're in a 50-minute class, it may be 7 minutes for the warm-up. Now, students transition to 8th grade. So what I would do is I would have the warm-up completely on the screen with a 7-minute timer. So immediately when that bell rung, we had 7 minutes. Well, we had 11 minutes, 4 minutes for transitions, and then 7 minutes to do your warm-up. So I would start an 11-minute timer. So if you got to class a little earlier, you would have more time. If you got to class late, you had less time. If you got to class on time, depending on when you got to class, you would always have at least 7 minutes to finalize that warm-up. When I started doing this and had a timer on the board, what I started to see is an increase in students that actually took the time to get it done. Because then I started creating incentives attached to it, or potential grades attached to it, or some type of work attached to it that would lead us into the specific lesson. I think a lot of times what happens in classes that I've seen or teachers that I've observed is we're spending too much time on specific parts of our lesson. So by the time we get to a mini lesson, we're not able to give enough time to that specific lesson because we've spent so much time redirecting and guiding, and our pacing is off throughout the specific lesson. Now, once I had the warm-up, I taught ELA, so it was 7 minutes. In that 7 minutes, I'm walking around, I'm touching base with students, I'm academic as well as progress monitoring throughout my classroom, and then we would go directly to the vocab strategy. That vocab strategy, let's say it was another 7 to 10 minutes on the board, and then they would be actively doing something. I would teach it, give them the specific requirements, I would hook them in, give the thesis on the slide, understand their takeaways and what's required from them, and then they would get to work, okay? So then we would be working on that. I'm, again, walking throughout the classroom, doing my laps, doing my loops, and showcasing what is required from my students during this time. In the last episode, we talked about the importance of educators modeling the expectations in the classroom. I would have an exemplar on the board. What that is essentially an example of what a completed product looks like specific to the work that they're supposed to be finishing, so that I created a standard of what that success would look like in the specific classroom as well. So once I got through my warm-up and we went through a vocabulary strategy, the next step would be a mini lesson. Now, this could be 15, 20 minutes, but this was not lecture. I was doing a mini lesson, and I differentiated the mini lesson in a way where I had my students in mind. So let's say I'm teaching author's purpose, or let's say I'm teaching specific strategies in reading or ELA and having students understand compare and contrast. If I know that I am at a culturally diverse institution or a school, and my students are having trouble with understanding terms of compare and contrast and breaking down these literary terms, then what I could do at the beginning in the warm-up is the warm-up could be the students comparing two artists. So let's compare Nicki Minaj to Cardi B. And then I want you to write down why you believe it, and you have to prove it. So now what we're doing is we're teaching them a skill set. We're teaching them to compare and contrast. We're having them cite textual evidence so that they can be able to showcase another skill. Then we're also having them understand it enough to be able to make claims and inferences and then be able to argue. All of those are still skills that we need to teach our students in ELA. So by the time we get to it in the actual lesson where I'm teaching these things, now I can go back to what we did in the warm-up, and it's guiding them throughout the whole lesson. The problem that we've seen in school and in teaching is that there's no real sequence of teaching. If I open up with a completely different warm-up, and then the vocabulary strategy is completely opposite, and then I go to my mini lesson, you're losing students throughout the transition of your specific lesson. So what I would recommend is whatever your warm-up is, connect that to that vocab strategy or that next step in your sequence, and then connect that to bridging in to how you're teaching your mini lesson as well. So once I got through my mini lesson, again, we're doing checks for understanding, we're doing progress monitoring, we're ensuring that the students are taking the notes, we're having an open discussion throughout this time period, we're laughing, we're chatting, we're giving them ideas, we're showing videos, we're also showing specific texts, we're reviewing texts throughout teaching them so that they can understand these skills. And then after the mini lesson is completed, then we go directly to guided practice, so that I am modeling how to actually showcase the skill that we learn in this culturally relevant way, so that you can do this with a fable. You can do this with a classical text. You can do this with a text that is on the EOG. Now, it may not be reading lyrics, it may not be reading a song, but now you've understood the skill. So I've built up your confidence to know the skill. I've built up your muscle to be able to understand what you need to be able to do. And now you have the courage as a student. You have the confidence as a student. You have the notes to fall back on. So now you're able to, now an independent activity or group rotations, I'm now able to see where the gaps are. Now, I know this is a more technical episode where I'm teaching you these various steps, but as a teacher and as an educator, it's our job to keep our kids engaged. And it's important for us to be culturally relevant in our classrooms. Now, your students may not like rap. They may not like R&B. They may not like college athletes or whatever the case may be. You have to understand your students and have a relationship enough with your students to meet them where they are, create warm-ups, create initiatives, create texts where they can understand it on their level. And now when you reintroduce them something within your curriculum, now it's easier for them to be able to follow. And then once I got through guided practice and rotations, we would then present an exit ticket just for my purposes and my data to ensure that my students have learned or have mastered the specific skill or the specific standard that we are teaching that day. And then we would go back to recapping. So let me walk you through those steps again. Now, when we got started, I gave you 5 steps. I wanted you to have 5 steps to transform your overall flow within the classroom, okay? So those 5 steps, again, are number 1 is create a hook. What are you gonna do within the first 30 to 60 seconds within your classroom to drive engagement? Number 2 is a thesis. You need to have your students know what we're going to cover, why it's important, and have them write it down. Number 3 is you need to have some takeaways. What are the students going to be able to do? What are the students going to be able to accomplish before they leave the lesson? So that you're creating a standard and showing them what success looks like at the end of this lesson. Step number 4 is the content. We break down content in warm up, some form of math or vocab strategy or science strategy, something that aligns with specific standards. Then you go into a mini lesson, a guided practice, and then independent student activity or group rotations depending on the model of your school, and then an exit ticket. Now you can base it on time. I would leverage timers on the board so that you can keep students on pace and on count. Do not falter from the time, okay? And then the last step to this model, the 5th step, is to bridge in to your next lesson. Once you've given them the exit ticket, you then go to the center of the class where you make announcements. You command the room and you say class, and they say class, class, or you say let's, and they say lock in, or you say when I say 1, 2, they say 3, 4, whatever you want to do to be able to get them back on track. And I miss these days as an educator, whatever you want to say to get them back on track. Before we dismiss today, this is the question that I want you to answer before you come to class tomorrow. And then if they answer that question leads them into the warm-up for the next day. Or it has them thinking about a concept for the next specific day. You can do this. I believe it. One of the biggest mistakes that I see in education and teachers is pacing. Pacing can be met, and pacing can be accomplished if you prepare. If you spend time preparing your lessons, if you spend time knowing your students, if you prepare by understanding your standards and unpacking those standards, if you prepare by knowing the curriculum, I can guarantee you will be transformative in the classroom. This is another episode of the Contagious Culture Podcast. We'll see you guys next episode.